Imagine a world where the most powerful and richest man didn't care about war, but instead spent his life collecting strange and beautiful things. This man was the Duke of Berry, and his story is a tale of luxury, art, and the chaos of medieval Europe. In the year 1386, Europe was on the brink of a massive invasion. The French, led by the ambitious King Charles VI, were planning to cross the English Channel and launch a full-scale attack on England. The plan was grand: a portable town, thousands of soldiers, and a fleet of ships ready to transport them. But there was one problem: no one could find the Duke of Berry. The Duke of Berry was a key figure in the French court. He was supposed to be the driving force behind the invasion, but he was nowhere to be seen. His absence was more than just a delay. It was a sign that not everyone in France was on board with the war. The peace party, represented by Berry, was quietly opposing the war party. Berry was more interested in his collections of art and treasures than in military conquest. Berry was a man of immense wealth and taste. He owned 2 luxurious residences in Paris and 17 castles, scattered across his duchies of Berry and Auvergne. His homes were filled with clocks, coins, enamels, mosaics, and all sorts of curiosities. He had a vast collection of illuminated books, musical instruments, and tapestries. His castles were like museums, filled with relics and artifacts from ancient times. He even owned one of Charlemagne's teeth, a piece of Elijah's mantle, and Christ's cup from the Last Supper. Berry's love for art and beauty was legendary. He commissioned some of the most exquisite books of hours, including the Grands Heures and the Tres Riches Heures, which are still considered masterpieces today. These books were beautifully illustrated, showing scenes from daily life, religious events, and Berry himself, often dressed in a sky-blue robe, a color so rare and expensive that it was a symbol of his wealth and status. Despite his refined tastes, Berry was not a popular ruler. He was known for his heavy taxation, which he used to fund his lavish lifestyle. The people of Auvergne and Languedoc suffered under his rule, and their resentment eventually led to an insurrection. Berry's response was to sell pardons and impose enormous fines, which only made the situation worse. He continued to spend extravagantly, even when it meant ruining his lands and dying insolvent in 1416 at the age of 76. In October 1386, Berry finally arrived at the Scheldt, the river where the French fleet was gathered. By then, the weather had turned cold and stormy, and the sea was rough. Just a few weeks earlier, disaster had struck when an English squadron attacked a French convoy carrying parts of the portable town. The English captured 3 ships, including the master carpenter in charge of construction, and paraded the captured sections of the town in London. This was a huge blow to French morale. The monk of St. Denis, a chronicler of the time, reported that the elements seemed to be against the French. He described storms that uprooted trees and destroyed buildings, and clouds of crows carrying lighted coals that set thatched barns on fire. These omens added to the growing sense of unease among the French leaders. Despite the bad omens and the worsening weather, the French leaders tried to push forward with the invasion. However, the captains of 150 ships submitted a list of reasons why it was impossible to set sail. They cited the long nights, the dark and cold conditions, the need for a full moon, and the perilous nature of the English coastline. The list of excuses was long and detailed, suggesting that the decision to postpone the invasion had already been made. The invasion was called off, and the Grand Army disintegrated. Perishable supplies were sold to the Flemings at a loss, and the portable town was given to the Duke of Burgundy. The English, who had been preparing for the attack, celebrated their good fortune. Berry's reluctance to go to war was well known. He had no interest in the invasion, and had been in communication with the Duke of Lancaster, who was also interested in peace. The two had met earlier in the year, and both seemed pleased with the outcome. The idea of a negotiated peace was gaining support on both sides, especially among the mercantile class, who saw the war as a drain on resources and a hindrance to trade. Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, could have sailed without Berry, but he was wary of leaving the kingdom in control of his brother. The Royal Council also had doubts about the military success of the invasion. Crossing the Channel was always a risky venture, and the French lacked the beachheads and ports that the English had in places like Calais and Bordeaux. The idea of a successful invasion seemed increasingly unlikely. The following year, a smaller invasion was planned under the command of the Constable and Coucy. In March 1387, King Charles VI visited Coucy-le-Château to discuss the plans. The document from this visit mentions provisions for the army that Coucy would take to England. However, the plan was more of a raid than a full-scale invasion. The expedition was to be split into two parts, with one group leaving from Brittany and the other from Harfleur in Normandy. Their objective was Dover, and they were to take 6,000 men at arms, 2,000 crossbowmen, and 6,000 other soldiers. They were also to bring enough food and supplies for 3 months. The preparations were well underway, and the fleet was ready to set sail. However, the English found an unlikely ally in Jean de Montfort, the Duke of Brittany. Montfort had a complicated relationship with both England and France. He was a chronic conspirator who often changed sides, depending on what would benefit him most. He had a particular grudge against Olivier de Clisson, the Constable of France, and was working with the English to disrupt the French plans. Montfort's involvement ultimately led to the failure of the invasion. The English, led by Sir Harry Percy, known as Hotspur, conducted coastal raids that distracted the French and delayed their preparations. The French fleet, despite being ready to sail, never made it across the Channel. The Duke of Berry's absence and the failure of the invasion were significant moments in the history of medieval Europe. They highlighted the complex politics and personal interests that often overshadowed grand military plans. Berry's love for art and luxury, while fascinating, ultimately prevented him from playing a more active role in the war. The story of the 1386 invasion is a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected factors can determine the course of history.